I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. This week, I'm joined by Alissa Wilkinson, a film critic for the New York Times, who joined the Times last November. We're here to talk about Dune, the 1965 science fiction classic by Frank Herbert, and we're also here to talk about the two film versions, the latter of which was recently released in theaters worldwide to critical acclaim and pretty big box office returns. Millions of people have read Dune since it came out nearly 60 years ago, and a lot of people have seen both of these films. So this is going to be a pretty sort of full spoiler conversation for both book and film. You're warned, forewarned is forearmed. Alissa, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Alissa, you wrote about the first of Denis Villeneuve's Dune adaptations when that film was released in 2021. You were a critic for Vox at the time. And before doing so, you read the book, which has been really a mainstay of the science fiction canon for a very long time. So let's start there. What did you think of the book when you read it?
It took me one full summer to read it. I had known that I should have read it before then. My undergraduate was at a STEM school, so this was like one of the holy texts alongside Lord of the Rings and the Star Wars movies. But I hadn't read it till then, and I did not enjoy it at all until the last 300 pages or so. So I want to say my edition, I believe, is 869 pages. A shorter one has come
you
out
have
since.
The mass market paperback. I have the trade paperback. These are the editions, the newer editions. Yours looks pretty thick.
It's very thick. It was like carrying around a little brick all summer long, but it would have been impossible to read electronically. So I'm glad I read it on paper. Science fiction is not my genre. I read a lot, but that was just it's not really something that I love reading so much. I prefer movies usually that are science fiction. But Dune is got a lot of geopolitics in it, which is hard to slog through when the names are all unfamiliar and I don't love that kind of thing to begin with. So with that said, I think I found Herbert's prose to be purple and confusing a lot of the time. At the same time, once I got to those last 300 pages, I was really into it because suddenly everything I thought I knew about this world, I discovered was a little bit wrong. And that suddenly made it very exciting. And I remember reading those and being like, oh, I wish the whole movie or the whole book was this. The book is centered on Paul Atreides, who is maybe this kind of messianic figure. And I feel like the template that we're used to with these kind of heroes' journey stories is that the Messiah figure is often appointed by a god or some kind of a supernatural being that's running that world. And the way Dune is set up, that is called into question. It doesn't exist. That is not the setup for this. Instead, Paul is essentially the result of a long eugenics project by a amazing sisterhood of these women who are trying to control the fate of humanity. This is all set 10,000 years in the future after the AI uprising where the human race narrowly managed to survive. So they've been doing this engineering for 10,000 years. And once you start to understand that, there's a lot of interesting pieces here and that nobody in this book is the good guy and nobody is really the bad guy. They're all just kind of people who are part of a larger system or plot, or I don't even know what to call it. It's just there's a lot of engineering going on. And that I found really interesting, even if you can feel the very 1965-ness of the book. I think that there's a lot there to chew on. And it makes the end of the book very exciting as well, because it ends on what feels like essentially a cliffhanger. Well, what's going to happen next? All we know is that this, in the book it's called a jihad, in the movie it's called a holy war, is coming. And what the result of that will be is like totally unclear from the book. And you actually really want to know what happens next. And I love that in a book.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the book vis-a-vis the first movie. We're going to get to the second movie, which we both have seen shortly. But when you wrote about this at the time in 2021, and for those who don't recall, the first Dune, directed by Denis Villeneuve, starring many of the same people, Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya, Josh Brolin, a lot of these people, was released simultaneously in movie theaters and to streaming on HBO Max. And even then, at the time, it still made a pretty impressive amount of money for something that was released simultaneously. And one of the interesting things about it to me is that Dune is this central science fiction text in the English-speaking world. It is something that's been around for almost 60 years. And yet there's something about it that even people who consider themselves nerds, geeks, into that sort of stuff find a little off-putting. And I've been trying to think about why that might be. I actually have talked to several people who I consider to be primo. I'm into superheroes, I'm into Star Wars, I'm into all of this stuff. And Dune is just something that never hit them in the right way. I wonder why you think that might be.
There's a couple things that I think are really unsettling in Dune. One is the vision of Frank Herbert was, I believe, to basically write a book that questioned authoritarians and hero mythology genuinely. Across the board, any kind of a hero figure, he sort of is proposing, will always have things and people come up alongside that hero figure that distort their influence. Even if they intend well, if they're benevolent, there's still all of this really awful stuff that comes along with it. And so Paul as a Messiah figure, we believe he wants good things for most of the book, and then he turns on a dime, or it feels like he might be turning on a dime. You can never quite tell where anyone stands in this book. And I think that is unsettling, especially because so many of the other kinds of things that we watch, the superhero movies, the Star Wars, whatever, there's like a clear-cut good and evil fight going on. Good and evil don't really exist in Dune, I don't think. There's definitely characters that we root for, and there's characters that seem to be obviously bad. But at the end of the day, anyone who you think is good might turn out to be bad, and you're not even sure what the standard for bad is. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, it's like a very strange thing to read. You're always kept off kilter, and it doesn't have the satisfying cathartic conclusion of a battle between good and evil. So I think that's a big part of it. I also just it's hard to keep track of what's going on in these books. Sure. And as the universe has expanded for Dune, it becomes even more and more difficult over time, which can be really fun for some people, but it is not particularly for everyone.
Let's briefly talk about that expansion, just so that readers maybe who have only read Dune or only familiar with the movies really understand the scope of Frank Herbert's universe at this point.
Herbert wrote 6 novels. He wrote Dune, and then there are 5 sequels: Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God, Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. But then there's this whole, I don't even know how many, dozens, I want to say, of other books that are like prequels and sequels and sidequels, most of which are written and overseen in some way by his son, Brian Herbert. And that makes for a lot of reading. And sometimes you just have to fall down a bit of a Wikipedia hole in order to figure out what the plot.
You almost said wormhole.
I really did, yeah. And the characters are resurrected a bunch, and people have one another's names, which is pretty standard sci-fi fantasy stuff. But all of it still centers on the idea of, if you are a benevolent dictator and you have a vision for the preservation of humanity, does that excuse ruling with an iron grasp? Like fascism, basically. It's an exploration of fascism, but there's a lot of other stuff mixed into it. Nuclear war and the possibility of that, and also questions about, again, AI is actually existent in this, or it was in this universe. And they're not supposed to ever create machines with intelligence. So that's another big question here. So there's just all this interesting stuff floating around in the middle of it. That said, I think most people to this point have read Dune, the first one, and then unless you're a real hardcore nerd, you might have just dropped off after that one.
Yeah. And
we have the benefit of being able to go look up the plot of the next movie or the next book if you're really excited to know what happens next. But at this point, there's so much of it that it's a lot. I don't know how many people have read every Dune book.
I know they're out there.
Yes.
And maybe we'll hear from some of them in the comments or through our email account. One of the things, certainly if you read this after having dipped into the world of Game of Thrones, you find a lot of resonances in terms of the number of themes that are juggled by the author at once. So you talk about authoritarianism, there's religion, there are warring families in this sort of futuristic feudal society. There is, in Dune, there's a whole ecological theme, and in Game of Thrones, arguably there's a climate change analog. There's all this court intrigue that happens. It's sci-fi, but it also feels like some version of Wolf Hall, maybe, with all these people whispering in each other's ears and plots upon plots. It's fascinating to see the ways in which sci-fi and fantasy storytelling maybe have branched off from what Dune launched.
And I think the religion part of this is very interesting because the religion in Dune is purely utilitarian. The Bene Gesserit have seeded belief in this messianic figure, the Kwisatz Haderach, who turns out to be Paul, among the Fremen, who are the stand-in for the ordinary person in the book. And they've seeded that belief because they foresee a time in the future when it will become useful to them to manipulate that belief in order to gain control over the person who will become the emperor. But there's all kinds of like weird sciencey stuff in it too, right? Yeah. They can manipulate themselves on a cellular level. Jessica, who is Paul's mother, has chosen to have a boy even though she was ordered to have a girl, and thus bucked this system that the Bene Gesserit have been setting up. So there's all this old and new stuff stuck together in the book, and that is part of what really does make it so delightful and also makes it feel very much 1960s to me. The questions of evolving science and technology combined with real fear about human extinction are all in there.
One of the things that, and this has been commented on many times before, is particularly interesting about Dune the book is that it's both hard sci-fi, hopefully I'm using that term correctly, and not, right? So it takes place 20,000 years in the future, and yet you don't have robots, you don't have computers because of this plot point that Frank Herbert baked into the story, which is 10,000 years before, there is this thing that happens. In the book, it's called the Butlerian Jihad. Boy, the phrases and terms in this book are insane, in which humanity essentially overthrows the use of computers and robots. And at some point, they make a new version of the Bible called the Orange Catholic Bible that they write certain precepts into, some of them being, hold on, let me see if I can find this. Man shall not be replaced. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a man's mind. So it's in the future. It's far in the future, but you don't have robots. You don't have computers. Instead, you have humans that are trained to be computers, in essence. They're called mentats. You see some in the first movie. You don't really see them in the second movie. So you have that fascinating concept. You have psychics or psychic ability. You have religion. You have mysticism. There's, in the book and in the second movie, this big sci-fi epic, and yet the big culminating battle is a knife fight between two people at the end, right? So it really is this mix of super futuristic and throwback.
It really reminds me of one of my favorite novels, which is A Canticle for Leibowitz, which was published in 1959 and is looking at kind of humanity through the long view in a post-nuclear age. And I have, the thing I really appreciate about great sci-fi is that it tells you everything about the anxieties of the moment in which it was written. And Leibowitz jumps forward in the future over and over. I mean, by the end of Herbert's Dune novels, I believe we're 4,000 years past the point that Dune begins in. And yet we're still with Paul Atreides' son who's ruling. So there's just a lot of mind-bending experimentation going on. But again, I think the very fuzzy line between the good and the evil, Game of Thrones is a great example of this, but it just makes it hard given that everything that came after, including Star Wars, was so incredibly based on Dune in a lot of ways, gives us a different way to interpret the same kind of a world. And that's very complex and hard to deal with. And I think Villeneuve has done a pretty good job of that, but still you're sitting there going, I don't know what to think the whole way through.
You mentioned Star Wars and briefly when you talked about all the sequels and the spin-offs that were written after Frank Herbert died, you made me think about this period. And just full disclosure, when I was a teenager, I was definitely a Star Wars nerd. And there was this period between 1983 when Return of the Jedi came out and 1999 when the first of the prequels came out, in which the Star Wars universe was kept alive by books. There were no movies, there were no TV shows, really, in the way that there is now, where it feels like there's Lucasfilm and Disney are really just trying to pump out these things to keep the franchise going. There were books, and they were authorized books by Lucasfilm, but they really took the story in all these different directions. And that was the thing that allowed people to really expand on the Star Wars universe in a way that both has happened with the Dune sequels and not, because the person, Frank Herbert's son, has been the one who remains, which is totally his right, it's his dad, in control of this universe.
Right. The Star Wars situation, all of those things really do feel, I know they're not fan generated, but there's an aspect of them that feels that way to me. And this is more of the top-down approach to a world, which can work if you have a really big imagination. And there's certainly very intriguing ideas that are floating around. But at the same time, I still love that, a book, again, reflects the anxieties of its time. And when it stretches over many decades, the anxieties change. So often these franchises tend to lose the plot, essentially, from their original instantiations because we're just living in a different time than 1965. Although there are many similarities still.
I agree. To jump ahead briefly to our discussion of the movie, there was a point in the second film, and again, we're discussing all sorts of plot points from the second film, in which they find the family atomics, the family's cache of nuclear bombs.
Yes.
Wow. It's really, nuclear bombs are everywhere these days.
I know. I was like, oh, the Leo DiCaprio meme where you kind of point at and I was like, it's Oppenheimer. What would he say? But yeah, there's been quite a bit of chatter about atomics in pop culture in the last year. So I guess Dune fits into that.
Alissa, I feel like this is a great point to sort of dig into the movies and the ways in which adaptation has either strengthened the story or weakened the story. But first, let's take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm here with Alissa Wilkinson, a film critic for the New York Times, and we are talking the book and film versions of Frank Herbert's Dune. So, Alissa, you have seen Dune Part 2. I have seen Dune Part 2. So many other people have seen Dune Part 2. What were your thoughts?
I really loved it. I really liked the first movie a lot. But this one I liked even more. One of the things I really loved about it is it's a big budget movie. It's a spectacle movie. It is visually absolutely mind-blowing. And the audio, too, actually, is really quite incredible. And yet it has a lot of artistic integrity. You really can feel Denis Villeneuve coming through the movie at you, even though it feels like a very faithful adaptation in many ways to Dune. And I think the part that sticks out to me the most is there's a bit in the middle where they're like on the planet where the Harkonnens live, who are the real baddies in the film. And he just came up with this idea that it's lit by like a black sun or something like that. And so the whole thing is suddenly black and white when they're in the sun. All the color is sapped out. And then add to that the way he's conceived of what their place looks like. And it looks like a Fritz Lang movie or something. It's like really interesting looking. And that was just his way of signifying a particular kind of place visually. So I love that. And then I'll say the other thing I continue to love about these movies is Dune is full of a lot of people's thoughts. We can see inside the heads of many characters. And in the movies, none of that is done that way. We never hear their inside thoughts unless there's a really good reason for it. And instead, we actually are watching actors give performances. And I had forgotten how fun it is to see actors give real performances in a movie of this size. Because a lot of blockbusters are so dependent on plot and on what you already know about the character that there isn't a lot of room for them to grow and develop. And this is somehow totally different.
I agree with much of what you said. I just saw it yesterday, actually. Yeah. So it's still pretty fresh. And this is a lot of movie. Yes. I mean, it is. I feel like I'm saying it with some sort of judgment, but I'm just stating it is a long movie and there is a lot in it. And it is pretty overwhelming. And I do agree Of course, it's not being released simultaneously on HBO Max, so you don't really have a choice other than to go out and see it. But as I tried to explain to my child, who I dragged to the movie yesterday, one of the reasons we go to movie theaters is to be overwhelmed by big images and big sound that you just cannot approximate at home. So it is a spectacle. The sound is incredible. I do feel like we can talk a little bit more about this, in the last third of the movie, it just gets really packed with plot, and you're talking about plot. But the first half of the movie, let's say, really continues to do something that these movies do well, which is to build a world and to set a mood and to make you understand a people, right? We really dig into a little bit further into this society of the Fremen, which is the indigenous people that live on Arrakis, the planet that's also known as Dune. And that to me is just something, again, that you do not see in big budget movie making. There's so much shorthand that needs to happen. And because this is a movie that's broken into two parts, but because it's also not a TV show and it only has a limited amount of time, it has to toe this line between building this world, sort of showing you all the money that they spent, but also moving a story and a plot ahead that is incredibly Byzantine.
Yes. And very textured. There's so many different kinds of cultures that you have to immediately understand from looking at them in this. You have to know a little bit of who these people are just by looking at their clothing and where they live and what color their eyes are, right? That's part of the spice that the Fremen have. But it also lingers on some of the most fun stuff I've seen. I mean, Paul riding a giant sandworm is incredibly exhilarating. It was the first time I was like, oh, I might want to see this in 4DX, which I usually reject as a concept.
Right before we came down here to record, I was talking to one of our editors who saw it in 4DX, and he has a lot of thoughts. I'm going to connect you to after this.
I would love to. Yeah, I've seen a few movies in 4DX.
I don't think you're getting sand in your face in 4DX.
No, but I do want to feel the wind on my face when the sandworm is traveling across the desert at high speeds.
Can you explain what 4DX is to people, our listeners who don't know?
It's sort of like going to an amusement park ride in a movie theater. So you sit in these seats and they can like herky jerk around with things that are happening on the screen. They also blow air at you. Sometimes they poke you in the back. And at least pre-pandemic, they used to have a phenomenon that they called face water that could happen. I've heard they stopped doing that post-COVID, but my first 4DX film was Geostorm, and there was a lot of face water. It was very unpleasant.
That is a terrible term.
Yes. It's theirs, not mine.
It is interesting to hear you talk about the lack of interior monologue, which, back to the book for a moment, there's so much of in Frank Herbert's book. You will have a character talking, and then you will have another character in the room saying, well, thankfully he doesn't know what I really think, and there's a lot of that. And for anyone who's seen the 1984 David Lynch version of Dune, there's so much voiceover. Apparently, they couldn't figure out how to convey this interior monologue in any other way. And the David Lynch version has certain strengths, a lot of weaknesses. But if you sort of want a prime example of why too much voiceover or how too much voiceover can really hurt a film, that is a prime example. There's a reason that screenwriters try to stay away from voiceover as much as possible.
It truly is. In this way, it's very similar to another book to film adaptation, one of my personal favorites, The Devil Wears Prada, in which the book is just interior monologue of the main character, and you end up hating her by the end. And in the movie, we don't hear her interior monologue. We just see what's happening, and it makes it such a better thing than the book itself. So Dune and The Devil Wears Prada are basically the same, is what I'm saying.
One of the things that stood out to me the most, and I guess I didn't really expect it, although I should have, having read the book, is how much talk there is about religion in Dune Part 2.
Yeah.
There's so much conversation about belief and fanaticism, which is a word they use in the movie that I believe they don't use in the book. And is faith real? Can faith be manipulated by a strong man or someone who has the ability to become a strong man? It's heady at parts in all of that conversation. It moves, even though it still looks amazing, it moves away from the spectacle, and it's a bunch. It's Paul and his mother, Paul and Stilgar talking about religion.
Yes, and also Chani, who is Zendaya's character, she loves Paul, but she's the one Fremen who seems to not believe in him. as a religious figure. And he doesn't really believe in himself as any kind of a savior figure, but he starts to see how the system has been set up for him to be that figure, like it or not. And a lot of this feels, of course, it is Frank Herbert's idea of the ability to harness beliefs that already exist in a culture in order to gain control of that culture. And mythologies have been used by figures throughout time to do that. But it's also, I think, designed to have everyone call into question anything that they believe, whether it's a religious figure or kind of a quasi-religious figure, and think about how you arrive at that belief. There's a sense in which I think the story, especially as the movie sets it up, is designed to make you think about the orthodoxies that you hold dear and where you got those orthodoxies and whether they were given to you in a way that you didn't even understand. And in the book and the movie, but it's very clear in the movie, there's a separation between believers and fundamentalists, which is like a hardened version of belief where it's ideological instead of spiritual. And that's very interesting and feels very modern to me in the movie and very thought-provoking.
How so?
Well, ideological fundamentalism is something that takes the beliefs and rules of a religion or a belief system and turns them into kind of bludgeons to keep people in line. Whereas Stilgar's version of what's going on here is that he's found someone he can really believe in to give them freedom. And so underneath all of this is the question of freedom. And when do belief systems promote freedom or bring freedom, and when do they cause bondage?
One of the main changes from the book to Dune Part 2 is this character that Zendaya plays, Chani. She's, as you say, she's reworked to be much more skeptical of Stilgar's belief. Stilgar is a character played by Javier Bardem. He's always great, but his role is necessary in this movie for the brief moments of levity that he provides. This is not much like the movies of Christopher Nolan. There's not a lot of humor in these Dune movies, but he sort of brings that taste of it to it. So Chani is skeptical of Stilgar's belief that Paul is the savior, the Lisan al-Gaib, the savior that the Fremen have been looking for. And in the book, she's much more faithful. She also believes, in the book, these events take place over years. In the movie, both movies combined take place over 9-10 months, or you could track it by Lady Jessica's pregnancy, which we should definitely talk about. So they take place over years. Chani and Paul are together. She's by his side. They bear a child together. There's all this stuff that happens, right? And so Denis and his co-screenwriter really make a choice to have that tension. It's a romantic tension, of course, as well, but it's also a philosophical tension exist between these two characters that just doesn't exist in the book.
And Zendaya just radiates intelligence as an actress always, no matter what she's doing. And so it really works beautifully to have her in this role of a more skeptical, more, I guess, free-thinking woman who's clearly a leader. You can almost imagine her conceived of as a foil to Paul, who's much more kind of scrappy. I would bet on Chani in the fight, not Paul. And he's much more, having been brought up the way he was, he's much more kind of being controlled by the Bene Gesserit, whereas Chani's entire loyalty, she keeps saying, is to her people. That's her belief system, is that her people deserve to be free. So there's something, again, that feels a bit more modern about this book, even though I would say I was pleasantly surprised in reading Dune that women play such a big role in the story, because that is not often true of sci-fi from that era.
There are a bunch of characters missing from both films as a whole, but certainly this second film. There's a character in the first movie played by the actor Stephen McKinley Henderson, Thufir Hawat.
Yes.
These guys, I cannot say these names with a straight face.
That's why you get a dunk in Idaho occasionally.
Absolutely. These names are all over the place. And he is one of the mentats. These are the people who are trained essentially to become human computers. And he, even though he persists throughout the book, he is not in Dune Part 2. And Denis Villeneuve has said, I love that character, but he said, I decided right at the beginning that I was making a Bene Gesserit adaptation. That means the mentats, these characters, are not as present as they should be. And HBO or some streaming service. I think it's HBO because there's a Warner Brothers movie, is maybe still developing a Bene Gesserit TV series. And that concept, those characters, this idea of these women who are called witches in this world being the ones that drive the fate of the universe was so interesting to the key architects of the film versions of the story that they are at the center of the whole thing.
That's my favorite part. I really hope that series gets made. The characters are really interesting. Jessica is such a fascinating character, Paul's mother, because again, with her, you're never quite sure where she stands or where you stand. She bore Paul as a boy because she loved his father. She had fallen in love with his father. But you come to realize, I think, more in this second movie, how often the Bene Gesserit have babies with royal people purely for this long-term eugenics project that they're working on. And we even end up with the point one of the Bene Gesserit, who's played by Léa Seydoux, returns to kind of give report and says, and I have the baby, and points to her womb. And that people should probably have complicated feelings about that, right? And that's true of everything else in the movie.
There is so much pointing at and talking to wombs in this movie.
Yes, we even get a lot of fetus on screen.
It was really, one of the first things that we see in the movie is the still unborn sister of Paul Atreides, Lady Jessica's child, who in the book, there's another change from the book. She is born. God, it's so hard to explain this because Lady Jessica drinks this water that comes from a drowned sandworm. The child inside of her essentially is a super being, right? Is born a Bene Gesserit and doesn't even have to be trained to be so. And in the book and in the David Lynch movie, she comes out, she is a child, but she is essentially fully formed. And she is the one that, instead of Paul, ends up killing Baron Harkonnen with the little poison, the Gom Jabbar. So they cut that out. It was too complicated, I imagine, to thread that in here. And again, the timing didn't work. But in lieu of that, you have Rebecca Ferguson, the actress, talking to her, holding her stomach and talking to her belly a lot.
Yes, and the child is continually talking to and about Paul from in utero. And he keeps saying, what is
really
she saying?
Insulting her brother from the womb the whole time.
It's incredible. And when you actually go read the plot of some of the next few books, you kind of realize that these two are going to have quite the relationship in the future. And that I won't spoil. But we do get one shot of the grown woman that she'll become. And it's Anya Taylor-Joy. For her.
And it's great. Before the movie, there's a trailer for the Furiosa prequel, and then you got Anya Taylor-Joy in your movie. She is a star.
Yes, she is, and she's an action star, as it turns out. Yeah, and there's also Florence Pugh in this movie, and as people have pointed out on Twitter, this is the second recent movie in which Florence Pugh is Timothée Chalamet's second socially acceptable choice for wife, if we count Little Women.
Little Women, a great movie, for those of you who haven't seen it.
Agreed.
We should have a whole episode about Greta Gerwig's adaptation of Little Women, which is one of the more charming movies I've watched in a very long time. I very
much agree. But if Florence Pugh is your second choice, you're probably just doing fine.
He's going to be fine. Timmy's going to be fine. So we talked briefly, or I sort of flicked at David Lynch's film adaptation. There's also, you wrote a piece about this recently, a documentary that is on HBO, or that is on Max. Is it called Max now? Whatever the streaming service is.
By the time this airs, it could be something else.
HBO Max with 2 X's plus, called Jodorowsky's Dune. Tell us about that.
It's quite wonderful. So it's a documentary about Alejandro Jodorowsky's attempt to make Dune. So it's sort of
And who's Jodorowsky, for those of our listeners who did not study film and were not alive in the 1970s?
Yeah, well, I did neither of those, actually, but he's an experimental filmmaker, Chilean French, I think. And he made movies like El Topo and The Holy Mountain. And he's got this very wild sensibility. And it was the 1970s and all the movies were weird. And so he was basically approached to direct this in 1974 by a French producer. Interestingly, one of the French producers was Michel Seydoux, who is Léa Seydoux's great uncle, and she's in this movie, so that's just funny. He had this really incredible vision that actually feels like it would have fit the book very well. The book is partly a product of Frank Herbert experimenting with psilocybins and magic mushrooms and things of that sort. And Jodorowsky had in his mind that he wanted to make a movie that made you feel like you'd done those without doing them. He had Pink Floyd lined up to do music. He wanted Orson Welles to play Baron Harkonnen, that makes sense, actually.
Didn't he want Salvador Dali to play the Emperor?
He wanted Salvador Dali to play the Emperor, and Dali wanted to do it, but he also wanted to be the most highly paid actor in Hollywood history and wanted $100,000 an hour to play the role, and they didn't have that in the budget, although Jodorowsky did initially agree to it. It was this wild, huge cast. They made these amazing drawings, basically, of how the whole thing would look. But the movie was going to be many hours long if it had ever gotten to that stage. And basically, the plug got pulled because there wasn't enough money. So when you watch the movie, Jodorowsky's Dune, which is about that kind of attempt, which Jodorowsky completely worked with. So he's in the movie, as are many of the other people who would have been participants. You see that this was influential, even though it was never made. So it's as influential on sci-fi filmmaking as Dune is on sci-fi writing, even though the movie doesn't technically exist. But Jodorowsky's Dune came out in, I believe, 2013, and it's a really fun watch.
One of the things that we have not really talked about at all is drugs.
Yes.
And it's amazing that we've gone this far talking about the movie Dune without literally once mentioning the word spice.
Yes.
Which is something that if you live on the planet, you ingest and you can become addicted to it, and it changes your perception. And the fact that it was written in the 60s, around the time when people started to sort of experiment with drugs on a mass basis, is something that cannot be detached from the book itself.
It's very much a mind-altering, mind-expanding drug, spices, but it also should be said it powers intergalactic flight in the book, and that's why it matters who controls it, because Paul threatens to basically shut down spice production unless he becomes emperor, and that would basically end the world because people couldn't move around freely. So it's like it's an addictive substance that also is required in order to have commerce and a galaxy. So you can read a lot of things into that, I think, but it is also just basically Coke.
Yeah, there's drugs. It's an analogy for oil. There's a lot going on in this book. Too much going on in this book. I feel like Denis Villeneuve, as a filmmaker and his screenwriter and his team, really did, despite all the things that they cut out, which is going to happen with any adaptation, did quite an impressive job in taking this large, naughty, influential book and making it into great popular art.
And if you watch the Lynch version from 1984 and see how janky it is, it's really nice to watch this one and have a completely different experience.
I love David Lynch, but it is a weird, gross movie.
There's a lot of sweating in that movie.
There's
and
pustules.
If there's anything you know about the planet Arrakis and the Fremen, it's that they harvest their own bodily fluids because there's so little water on that planet. Sweating is not going on there.
Water is precious.
Water is very precious.
This conversation has been precious. Thank you, Alissa.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with Alissa Wilkinson, a film critic for The Times, about both the film and book versions of Dune. Remember, fear is the mind killer. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.